Hey everyone, let's dive right into Disexplainer. Today we're doing a total dissection of two vastly different historical heavyweights who, honestly, completely shattered the status quo of their eras. Just picture this for a second. On one hand, you have a young king staring down an empire of literally millions. On the other, a humble patent clerk facing the towering, seemingly unquestionable legacy of Sir Isaac Newton. Both of these men were up against walls of absolute impossibility. Now, on the surface, an ancient, blood-soaked battlefield and a quiet, modern physics lab seem worlds apart, right? But when we actually look closer at the minds that dominated them, we start to see this shared architecture of true genius. So today, we are tearing down the boundaries between military history and theoretical science to figure out what it actually takes to rewrite the rules of reality.
So, here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're going to start with rewriting the rules, then move into Alexander the Creative Execution, and examine the conqueror's psyche. After that, we'll pivot to Einstein, the miracle year, dive into his quest for unification, and wrap things up by looking at the legacies of paradigm shifters. All right, let's get into it. Part 1, rewriting the rules. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly does a 331 BC Macedonian king have in common with a 1905 AD Swiss clerk? Well, true conquest doesn't just look one way. Imagine the staggering sensory contrast between these two achievements. On the one hand, you have the deafening roar of 150,000 marching soldiers, the clash of bronze, dust just choking the air on the plains of Gaugamela. And then, contrast that with the absolute pin-drop silence of a quiet Swiss office, where the only sound is just the scratching of a single fountain pen across 4 pieces of paper. Both of these men looked at the strictly established boundaries of their respective universes, and, well, they simply refused to accept them. Let's move to our first case study, Part 2. Alexander and the Creative Execution. What's absolutely fascinating here is how Alexander consistently faced overwhelming mathematical odds against the mighty Persian Empire, and still achieved total victory every single time. At Granicus, he forced a treacherous river crossing against heavily seasoned nobles. At Issus, he faced a colossal army of 100,000 men. And by the time he reached the plains of Gaugamela, his forces were outnumbered 5-1 by King Darius III's massive army. Under the normal rules of engagement in the ancient world, being outnumbered 5-1 wasn't just a slight disadvantage, it was a guaranteed death sentence. The sheer mass of the enemy line should have easily enveloped and crushed the smaller Macedonian force. By all conventional logic, Alexander's campaign should have ended right there in the dust. But he didn't just fight harder, He executed a repeatable, highly unique strategy. Imagine watching this unfold from a hill above the battlefield. Alexander would deliberately hold back his left flank. This created a dangerous illusion of weakness. It was this masterclass psychological trick, essentially baiting the massive Persian army to draw their forces away from the middle, to attack that seemingly vulnerable left side. Then once the Persian central nerve center was stretched thin and weakened, Alexander would personally lead his elite companion cavalry in a sudden, terrifying wedge formation. It was this precise, shockingly fast blast of destruction millennia before Napoleon even existed. He aimed straight for the heart of the enemy, King Darius himself, because he knew that if the leader broke and fled, that massive army would inevitably collapse. But strategy alone doesn't explain this. Part 3, the conqueror's psyche. To really understand how a person can repeatedly ride into a literal wall of spears without blinking, we have to examine the fascinating psychological cocktail that made Alexander who he was. Take a look at this diagram. It maps out how his internal traits interacted dangerously and perfectly with his external world. He possessed a grandiose sense of self-worth, and this was fueled heavily by his mother relentlessly telling him he was literally a demigod, the actual son of Zeus. He didn't just have confidence, he had a profound, unshakable belief in his own divinity. Coupled with the fierce, unquestioning loyalty of his troops, it created an unparalleled, ambitious drive that pushed him to the absolute edge of the known world. And this leads us to a pretty chilling realization about his tactical genius. His near invincibility in battle was heavily rooted in what we would now consider psychopathic traits. Think about it. An ordinary general might hesitate, right? Burdened by the heavy emotional weight of sending thousands of young men to a violent death. Normal empathy creates friction. But Alexander, he felt no such restraint. His extreme narcissism and total lack of remorse allowed him to execute these aggressive, exceptionally bloody strategies without ever feeling the emotional consequences. His profound lack of empathy was, terrifyingly, his greatest military asset. So this brings us to a really fascinating pivot. If extreme ruthlessness and an army of loyal soldiers are what it takes to conquer the physical world, what does it take to conquer the known universe? How do you actually wage war when your battlefield isn't a dusty plain, but the very fabric of space and time itself? Let's jump forward in time. Part 4. Einstein and the Miracle Year. Okay, let's dive into 1905. Back then, Albert Einstein wasn't the famous, wild-haired, older genius we all picture today. No, he was a 26-year-old, totally unknown patent clerk, just working quietly in Bern, Switzerland. And yet, in just a few short months, his Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year, he published 4 scientific papers that took a complete wrecking ball to centuries of established physics. Sir Isaac Newton's mechanics had ruled the scientific world unchallenged for hundreds of years. In a single year, this obscure clerk effectively toppled that entire regime. Let's break down exactly what was inside these reality-shattering papers.
The first massive blow was the photoelectric effect. For ages, scientists were highly comfortable thinking of light purely as a continuous wave, like ripples moving across a pond. But Einstein proved that light also had a quantum nature. It behaves like a tiny, discrete particle. Think of it like a miniature basketball. He made the bizarre, totally mind-bending suggestion that light could literally, physically hit matter and knock things out of place, just like a basketball knocking over a cup. This completely upended classical physics, and it was actually this revelation, not relativity, that eventually won him the Nobel Prize.
Then, of course, came special relativity. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson has a brilliant way of framing this to show just how weird it is. Picture yourself standing still on a train platform. A train goes flying past you at 60 miles per hour, and someone on board throws a baseball forward at 40 miles per hour. To you, on the platform, classical physics says that baseball is moving at 100 miles per hour, right? You simply add the speeds together. But Einstein realized light doesn't work that way. If someone on that moving train shines a flashlight, the speed of that beam of light remains exactly the same to everyone observing it, whether they are standing still or moving on the train. As Tyson points out, we don't add the speed of the train to the speed of the light. That absolutely defies our everyday logic. Einstein realized that if the speed of light is an absolute, unchanging constant, then something else has to give. Reality itself actually has to bend around that light. He deduced that space and time are not a fixed, rigid stage like Newton thought. Instead, they warp, stretch, and change so that the speed of light never does. Imagine a ticking clock. According to special relativity, if you travel incredibly fast, your clock actually ticks slower compared to someone standing perfectly still. Your very measuring stick of space and your rate of time are entirely relative to your speed. It was a complete paradigm shift in how human beings understand existence.
To put that into perspective, 186,000 is the speed of light in miles per second. That is the c in his famous E=mc² equation, which arrived in his 4th paper of that miracle year. It's visually such an incredibly simple equation, yet it's devastatingly powerful. He basically proved that energy and mass are not separate entities. They are just 2 sides of the exact same coin. A tiny amount of mass can be converted into a colossal amount of energy. This profound, elegant understanding of nature unlocked the fundamental secrets of the atom, eventually birthing both nuclear power and the dawn of the atomic age.
Which brings us to the final chapter of his life, Part 5, the quest for unification. Much like Alexander pushing his exhausted army endlessly eastward into India, refusing to turn back until his own men literally forced him to stop, Einstein spent his final 30 years on a relentless, solitary quest. He desperately wanted a unified field theory, one beautiful mathematical package to completely tie gravity and electromagnetism together. But, this highlights the tragic, double-edged sword of a conqueror's mindset. True conquerors rarely know when to stop. Einstein spent those 3 decades isolated, stubbornly rejecting the new quantum mechanics his peers were eagerly developing, absolutely obsessed with finding one elegant equation to rule the entire universe, right up until his final hours. So, what should you take away from all this? Part 6, Legacies of Paradigm Shifters. How exactly do we synthesize the king and the scientist? Well, whether the battlefield was the sprawling Persian Empire or the rigid, unbending rules of classical physics, their core mindset was identical. One used the brute force of heavy cavalry to physically crush a king. The other used the elegant logic of tensor calculus to fundamentally redefine gravity. But both men possessed this relentless, goal-oriented drive. They both looked at the established rules of the game, found them totally unacceptable, and forged entirely new realities that we still live in today. It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? I mean, we look back at the Persians thinking they were completely invincible, and the classical physicists thinking they had the universe completely figured out. So what currently unquestioned truths in our modern world are just waiting for a new 26-year-old clerk or a bold new thinker to completely dismantle them? Who will be the next genius to rewrite the rules? Thank you so much for exploring the anatomy of genius with me on this explainer. Keep questioning the rules, and I'll see you next time.